Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow journey back in time, not to mighty battles or epic voyages, but into the surprisingly snug, sometimes smoky, and always fascinating world of Viking longhouses. Imagine yourself trudging through a biting Scandinavian wind, the kind that whips your hair into a frenzy and makes your teeth chatter like castanets. You've been out all day, perhaps herding sheep, or maybe just desperately trying to keep your fingers from freezing off while tending to some chores. The sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, but also signaling the imminent arrival of truly bone-chilling darkness. You yearn for warmth, for shelter, for a place where the biting cold can't find you. Now, picture that yearning, amplified by 1,000 years, and you start to understand the sheer necessity of a good, solid longhouse. You're heading towards a low, turf-roofed structure, barely visible against the darkening landscape, but a beacon of warmth nonetheless. Forget your central heating and your double-paned windows. The Vikings had to get creative. You probably won't survive a night in a historical longhouse without some serious modern gear, but we're going to dive into how they managed it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open a heavy, creaking wooden door, and a wave of earthy warmth washes over you. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely animalistic, immediately feels different from the crisp, biting air outside. Your eyes, accustomed to the dimming light, slowly adjust to the even deeper gloom within. It's not pitch black, though. A flickering, dancing glow emanates from the center of the vast room, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls and ceiling. This isn't just a house. It's a living, breathing ecosystem designed for one primary purpose in the harsh Nordic climate: to keep you from becoming a human icicle. The very first thing you notice, beyond the smell and the immediate warmth, is the sheer scale of the place. These weren't your cozy little cottages. We're talking about structures that could stretch for 50, 70, even 100 feet or more, wide enough to house an entire extended family, their servants, and yes, often their livestock too. Think of it less as a single-family home and more as a communal living, working, and frankly, breathing space. This collective living was a mainstream historical fact that was absolutely crucial for warmth. Imagine everyone huddling together, sharing their body heat. It's like a giant, very low-tech cuddle puddle, but for survival. The design itself was incredibly simple, yet profoundly effective. You're standing on an earthen floor, perhaps a bit packed down from generations of foot traffic, and the walls rise up, often made of sturdy timber frames filled with wattle and daub, or sometimes even dry-stacked stone in more treeless regions. But the real genius, the quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked, is the turf roof. Picture thick layers of sod, sometimes several feet deep, laid over a framework of timber rafters. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was an insulating marvel. It absorbed heat during the day, slowly releasing it at night. And perhaps even more importantly, it acted as a massive, natural blanket, trapping precious warmth inside and deflecting the worst of the winter winds. It was basically a living, breathing green roof, centuries before it became a trendy architectural feature. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these massive turf roofs was insulation or simply the most readily available and cheapest material. But standing here, feeling the radiating warmth, you can't help but think it was a happy combination of both. The sheer weight of the turf also helped to anchor the structure against those formidable Atlantic gales, making the longhouse a truly resilient fortress against the elements. It wasn't just a building, it was a carefully engineered solution to a very cold problem, a testament to Viking ingenuity when it came to staying cozy. And as your eyes continue to adjust, you start to make out more details, hinting at the next layer of Viking warmth. As your eyes finally adjust to the dim, smoky light, you start to appreciate the architectural marvel you've entered. This isn't some hastily thrown together hut. It's a robust, purpose-built structure, meticulously designed to combat the relentless cold of the north. The longhouse, at its core, was a masterclass in passive heating. You'll notice the walls aren't just planks of wood. They're often surprisingly thick, constructed from various layers that work together to create an insulating barrier. In some regions, you'd see a double wall construction, with an inner and outer layer of planks, and the space between them filled with peat, moss, or even dried leaves. It was essentially an ancient form of cavity wall insulation, and it's a mainstream historical fact that this method significantly improved thermal performance. Imagine piling up blankets on your bed, but for your entire house. That was the Viking approach to wall insulation. The very shape of the longhouse, long and narrow with often rounded ends, also played a role in its thermal efficiency. This elongated form minimized the amount of external surface area relative to its internal volume, reducing the overall heat loss through the walls. Think of it like this. A sphere holds heat best, but it's hard to live in. A long, low rectangle is the next best thing for minimizing heat escape while still being practical for habitation. This subtle design choice is a quirky or fringe tidbit that often goes unnoticed, overshadowed by the more obvious features like the fire pit. But every little bit helped when you were trying to survive a Scandinavian winter. You might also notice the lack of large windows. In fact, windows as we know them were virtually non-existent. Any openings were small, often just narrow slits high on the walls, mainly for ventilation and perhaps a tiny bit of light, but never for expansive views. This was a deliberate choice. Every opening, no matter how small, is a potential pathway for precious heat to escape and biting cold to creep in. So, the Vikings opted for minimal breaches in their thermal envelope, sacrificing natural light for warmth. You'd probably find it incredibly claustrophobic by modern standards, but for them, it was simply practical. It's a bit like closing all your curtains and blinds in winter to keep the warmth in. They just took it to the extreme. Historians still argue whether the exact orientation of the longhouse was always intentional for solar gain, but it's clear that their positioning often took prevailing winds into account. You see, a structure exposed broadside to a constant icy gale would lose heat much faster. So, many longhouses were built with their narrow ends facing the harshest winds, allowing the wind to flow more easily around the building rather than slam directly into a large wall surface. It's a smart, almost intuitive understanding of aerodynamics, applied to architecture without the benefit of textbooks or wind tunnels. The roof, as we touched on, was a marvel in itself. Beyond the thick layers of turf and earth, the underlying timber framework was incredibly robust. Massive timbers, often sourced from nearby forests, formed the main supports, capable of bearing the immense weight of the turf. The sheer mass of the roof didn't just insulate, it also provided thermal inertia. This means it absorbed heat slowly from the fire pit during the day and radiated it back slowly throughout the night, helping to stabilize the internal temperature. It's like a giant thermal battery, constantly working to keep the inside from getting too cold too quickly. You might be shivering thinking about the effort involved in building such a roof, but the payoff in terms of warmth was immeasurable. And let's not forget the floor itself. While often just packed earth, some longhouses had raised platforms or sleeping benches along the walls. These weren't just for comfort. Getting up off the cold earthen floor, even by a few inches, made a significant difference. Cold air sinks, after all, so elevating yourself, even slightly, meant you were breathing and sleeping in slightly warmer air. It's a simple trick, but an effective one, especially when you consider that Vikings didn't have fluffy carpets or underfloor heating. They used every available surface and material to their advantage, turning basic geology into surprisingly effective insulation. Now that you've absorbed the sheer structural genius of the longhouse, your attention is inevitably drawn to its true beating heart, the central fire pit. You can feel its warmth radiating outwards, a comforting contrast to the chill that still clings to your clothes from outside. This isn't just a campfire. It's a meticulously managed, continuous source of heat, light, and the means to cook. It's a mainstream historical fact that the fire pit was the absolute center of longhouse life, both literally and figuratively. Imagine your living room, kitchen, and sometimes even your workshop all revolving around a single, glowing hearth. You see a long, shallow trench running down the center of the earthen floor, often lined with stones. This is where the magic happens. Logs, carefully selected and dried, smolder, and crackle, sending plumes of smoke curling upwards. But where does all that smoke go, you ask? That's where the ingenious, if imperfect, ventilation system comes in. Above the fire pit, directly in the roof, you'll spot a series of smoke vents or louvers. These weren't chimneys in the modern sense, but rather adjustable openings that could be partially closed or opened depending on the wind and the amount of smoke. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that, while effective, it certainly wasn't smoke-free. You'd definitely leave a longhouse smelling like a campfire, and your eyes might water a bit, but it was a small price to pay for warmth. Think of it as the ultimate rustic chic air freshener. The smoke, while a nuisance, actually served a secondary purpose. It helped to preserve the timber structure of the longhouse, acting as a natural pest deterrent, keeping insects and rot at bay. It also helped to cure meats and fish that might be hung from the rafters, adding to the longhouse's self-sufficiency. So, that smoky atmosphere wasn't just a byproduct. It was a multifunctional element of Viking life. You might even find yourself thinking, well, at least it kept the mosquitoes away, which, let's be honest, is a win in any era. Historians still argue whether the primary method of smoke control was through the adjustable vents or simply the natural convection currents created by the fire itself drawing the smoke upwards and out. Regardless, the system was designed to allow the smoke to rise, diffuse somewhat throughout the upper reaches of the longhouse, and then eventually escape. This meant that the air closer to the floor, where people were sitting and sleeping, was generally clearer and warmer. It was a clever, if somewhat basic, understanding of thermodynamics and air circulation. The fire itself wasn't just for warmth. It was a constant source of light in a world without electricity. Imagine the long, dark Scandinavian winters, where daylight hours were few and precious. The fire pit provided a steady, flickering illumination, allowing activities to continue long after the sun had set. You could mend nets, carve wood, tell stories, or simply sit and stare into the mesmerizing flames, losing yourself in the hypnotic dance of light and shadow. It was the original Netflix and chill, just with more smoke and the constant threat of frostbite if you strayed too far from the heat. Fueling this perpetual fire was a significant undertaking. You see piles of neatly stacked firewood nearby, a testament to the constant effort required to gather and prepare fuel. Wood, peat, and sometimes even animal dung were used, depending on what was available in the local environment. This wasn't just about throwing a few logs on. It was about managing a sustainable fuel source, a task that would have consumed a considerable amount of time and energy for the longhouse inhabitants. It's a reminder that even the most basic comforts required immense effort in the Viking Age. And finally, the fire pit wasn't just a static object. It was a dynamic, living entity. It was where meals were cooked, water was heated for washing, or perhaps just for a warm drink, and where tools might have been forged or repaired. It was the heart of the home in every sense, a constant presence that dictated the rhythm of daily life. You can almost hear the crackle and pop, feel the heat on your face, and smell the lingering scent of wood smoke, a testament to the enduring power of fire in a cold world. Having explored the fire pit, let's shift our gaze to the very fabric of the longhouse itself, the building materials that literally stood between the Vikings and the unforgiving cold. You're not seeing polished stone or perfectly milled lumber here. Instead, you're looking at a resourceful use of what the environment provided. This pragmatic approach to construction is a mainstream historical fact. Vikings were masters of utilizing local, readily available natural resources. In many areas, this meant a heavy reliance on timber, particularly oak, pine, and spruce, harvested from the abundant Scandinavian forests. These trees weren't just for structural beams. They were split into planks for walls, used as framing, and formed the very skeleton of the longhouse. The way they prepared and used this timber was quite ingenious. They didn't have modern sawmills, so logs were often split lengthwise using wedges, a process that followed the natural grain of the wood, making the planks incredibly strong and durable. These split timbers, often unrefined by today's standards, were then fitted together. You might notice gaps, not perfectly sealed like a modern home, but these were often minimized or filled in. This brings us to a crucial element: wattle and daub. This technique, a quirky or fringe tidbit often overlooked in favor of more dramatic Viking imagery, involved weaving pliable branches, the wattle, between vertical wooden stakes, creating a lattice. This lattice was then plastered with a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and sometimes even animal dung, the daub. Once dried, this created a surprisingly effective and insulating wall, much like a primitive form of concrete that still breathed. Imagine applying this sticky, earthy mixture, smoothing it over the woven branches, layer by layer. It would have been a dirty, hands-on job, but essential for creating a solid barrier against the wind and cold. The straw within the daub added insulation, trapping air pockets, while the clay and sand provided thermal mass, slowly absorbing and radiating heat from the central fire. It was a perfectly sustainable and locally sourced building material, requiring minimal processing beyond what could be done with hand tools. In areas where timber was scarce, like the treeless islands of the North Atlantic, think Iceland or Greenland, Vikings adapted their methods, showcasing incredible resilience. Here, you'd see longhouses constructed primarily from turf and stone. Large, flat stones would form the lower walls, providing a sturdy foundation, and then layers upon layers of carefully cut turf blocks would be stacked on top, much like bricks. Each turf block, with its entangled roots and soil, was a natural insulator. This transition from wood to turf as the primary structural and insulating material is another testament to their adaptability. Historians still argue whether the choice of specific building materials was solely based on availability or if there was an underlying, perhaps unarticulated, understanding of their insulating properties. It's plausible that trial and error over generations led them to the most effective combinations for their harsh climate. Regardless, the results were homes that, while appearing rustic, were remarkably resilient. The thick turf roofs, as we discussed, were not just a quirk. They were the crowning glory of their insulation strategy, sometimes reaching several feet in thickness and effectively becoming part of the landscape. The floors, as previously noted, were typically just packed earth, but even here, layers of rushes or straw might be laid down for added warmth and cleanliness, creating a softer, slightly insulated surface. It was a continual battle against the cold seeping up from the ground. Every component of the longhouse, from its foundations to its turf crown, was a deliberate choice aimed at one goal: maximizing warmth and minimizing heat loss. You can almost feel the deep connection these people had to their environment, shaping it to meet their most fundamental needs, turning earth and timber into a sanctuary against the biting Nordic air. It's a humble reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Now, let's talk about a design choice that might make you raise an eyebrow, but one that was undeniably effective for warmth: the inclusion of animals within the longhouse. You might be thinking, my house is barely big enough for me, let alone a cow. But for the Vikings, sharing their living space with livestock wasn't just a convenience. It was a clever, organic heating solution. This practice is a mainstream historical fact, particularly common in the colder regions and during the harsh winter months. You'd find cows, sheep, goats, and sometimes even pigs housed in a dedicated section of the longhouse, often separated from the human living area by a low partition or simply a slight change in elevation. Imagine the sheer amount of body heat generated by several large animals. It's like having a dozen furry, four-legged radiators in your home, constantly emitting warmth. This collective animal warmth was absolutely crucial, especially during the long, dark, and frigid nights when the central fire might have dwindled. It was a symbiotic relationship. The animals got shelter from the biting winds and predators, and in return, they became living heat sources, contributing significantly to the overall thermal comfort of the longhouse. You might even find yourself chuckling at the thought of a Viking farmer patting his cow and saying, "Thanks for the BTU, Bessie." This isn't just a quirky or fringe tidbit. It highlights a profound difference in ancient living. Our modern sensibilities recoil at the idea of sharing close quarters with farm animals, but for the Vikings, it was simply practical. The metabolic heat from the animals was a constant, reliable source of warmth, far more dependable than waiting for the fire to be rekindled in the morning. Plus, having the animals indoors meant they were safer from wolves and other predators, and it made morning chores, like milking, far more manageable when you didn't have to trudge through a foot of snow to the barn. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for housing animals indoors was purely for warmth, or if it was more about protection from the elements and predators, with the heating aspect being a very welcome byproduct. Regardless of the initial intent, the outcome was undeniable: a warmer longhouse. You can almost feel the gentle hum of animal life, hear their soft breathing, and perhaps catch a whiff of hay and, well, other farmyard scents. It certainly adds another layer to the sensory experience of a longhouse, doesn't it? Beyond the direct heat, the animals also provided another benefit. Their presence helped to slightly humidify the air. In a dry, cold environment, especially with a constant fire, the air can become incredibly dry. The moisture exhaled by the animals would have added a subtle amount of humidity, potentially making the air feel a bit less harsh on the lungs and skin. It's a small detail, but when you're talking about survival and comfort in extreme conditions, every little bit counts. Of course, living with animals came with its own set of challenges, predominantly related to hygiene and odors. But the Vikings were adept at managing these issues to the best of their abilities. Animal waste would be regularly removed, often used as fertilizer for fields, completing a continuous cycle of resourcefulness. The packed earth floors could absorb some moisture, and the constant ventilation, however rudimentary, helped to circulate air. It was a compromise, certainly, but one that offered tangible benefits in terms of warmth and security. So, as you stand in the longhouse, you're not just sharing space with humans. You're coexisting with a small, vital ecosystem designed to generate heat. The low murmur of cattle, the rustling of straw, and the subtle, earthy aroma remind you that survival in the Viking Age was a communal effort, extending even to the farm animals who unknowingly contributed their warmth to the human inhabitants. It's a vivid picture of how intimately connected their lives were to their livestock, a bond forged out of necessity and the relentless pursuit of warmth. With the living radiators of the animal section in mind, let's turn our attention to the human living space and how its furnishings and interior layout were meticulously arranged to maximize comfort and, crucially, warmth. You're now standing in the main communal area, where the flickering fire pit truly holds sway. This area wasn't just an open space. It was cleverly delineated, even without walls, by its simple furniture. This deliberate organization of space is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing a keen understanding of function and flow. Along both long walls of the house, you'll see raised wooden platforms or benches. These weren't just for sitting during the day. They served as sleeping platforms at night. Imagine a long, continuous bed running the length of the house, a bit like a permanent bunk bed without the top bunk. Sleeping on a raised platform, even just a foot or two off the earthen floor, was a smart move. Remember, cold air sinks. By elevating themselves, the Vikings were able to escape the coldest layer of air nearest the ground, benefiting from the warmer, rising air from the fire pit. It's a bit like trying to get warm in a sleeping bag on a cold floor versus on a cot. That elevation makes a surprising difference. These sleeping benches weren't exactly plush. They would have been covered with straw, animal furs, and woolen blankets for insulation and softness. This layering of natural materials was essential. Think of it as a low-tech version of modern insulation for your sleeping area. The furs, particularly from sheep, goats, and perhaps even bears or wolves, provided incredible warmth. This use of animal hides for bedding and covering is a quirky or fringe tidbit that, while common, highlights the Vikings' practical approach to leveraging every resource. They weren't just hunting for food or glory, they were hunting for warmth. The arrangement of these benches around the central fire pit also fostered communal warmth. When everyone was asleep or gathered on the benches, their collective body heat would further contribute to the overall temperature of the longhouse. It created a dense cluster of warmth in the very core of the living space. You can almost feel the gentle radiating heat from so many bodies, a cozy, if perhaps slightly stuffy, huddle against the external chill. Historians still argue whether the division of these sleeping areas was strictly by family unit or more communal, but it's clear that privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury. Life in a longhouse was lived largely in public, and personal space was limited. However, this communal aspect was a strength when it came to staying warm. There were no isolated rooms to heat individually. The warmth generated by the fire and the inhabitants spread throughout the main living area. Beyond the sleeping benches, you might see small, sturdy tables or chests. These weren't just for storage. They also served as surfaces for eating, working, and crafting. In a sense, every piece of furniture had multiple purposes, reflecting the efficiency required in a communal dwelling. Large wooden chests would store valuables, food, and clothing, helping to keep items dry and slightly insulated from the damp earth. The entire layout, from the raised sleeping platforms to the central fire, was designed for maximum heat retention and minimal fuss. There were no elaborate hallways or separate rooms to lose heat into. Every movement within the longhouse kept you within the warm envelope generated by the fire. You'd probably find it a bit cramped, especially with the smell of smoke, earth, and various bodily odors permeating the air, but there's an undeniable practicality to it. It wasn't about aesthetics, it was about survival. And in the dead of winter, a warm, if slightly crowded, longhouse beat a beautifully decorated but freezing hovel any day. Stepping back slightly from the physical layout, you start to grasp an even more fundamental aspect of Viking warmth: the power of social dynamics and collective body heat. This isn't about architectural design or fuel sources. It's about the simple, undeniable warmth generated by a group of people living in close proximity. This communal living was a mainstream historical fact, not just for practical reasons like shared labor and security, but also as an unspoken, yet incredibly effective, heating strategy. Imagine a large family, perhaps grandparents, parents, children, and even distant relatives, all sharing the same space. Each person, whether awake or asleep, is a miniature furnace, constantly emitting heat into the surrounding air. When dozens of people are gathered together in a relatively confined space, even a large one like a longhouse, their combined warmth can significantly raise the ambient temperature. It's the same principle as a crowded concert hall feeling much warmer than an empty one, or why a huddle of penguins can survive the Antarctic cold. You're essentially experiencing the original human blanket effect, but on a grand communal scale. This constant, low-level generation of heat from multiple bodies was a stable baseline for warmth, supplementing the more fluctuating heat from the fire pit. When the fire dwindled overnight, or during periods of particularly intense cold, the collective body heat of the sleeping inhabitants would have been crucial in preventing temperatures from plummeting to dangerous levels. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes gets overlooked when we focus on building materials, but the simple biology of human existence played a massive role in their thermal comfort. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for such large, communal dwellings was the need for collective defense, shared resources, or indeed, optimal heating. It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors. However, the thermal benefit of having many bodies in one building is undeniable. When you're living in a world without central heating, every degree gained, no matter the source, is a victory against the cold. Beyond the purely physical heat, there's also the psychological warmth of communal living. Imagine the long, dark, isolated winters. The presence of other people, the shared stories, the laughter, the sound of daily life continuing around you, would have provided a powerful sense of comfort and security. Loneliness and despair can make the cold feel even more biting, so the constant social interaction, even if sometimes fraught, was a vital component of enduring the harsh seasons. It's a bit like how a good, hearty laugh can make you feel warmer from the inside out, except amplified by an entire community. This close-quarters living meant a certain lack of personal space by modern standards. You couldn't just retreat to your own room for solitude. Life was lived in a constant state of shared existence. However, this enforced proximity fostered strong social bonds and a sense of mutual reliance. Everyone contributed to the warmth, directly or indirectly, through their presence. It was a shared endeavor, a collective fight against the elements, and in that shared struggle, there was a profound sense of belonging. You can almost feel the gentle hum of conversation, the quiet rustle of people moving about, the warmth emanating from the bodies around you. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective technologies aren't made of wood or stone, but of flesh and blood. The Viking longhouse was more than just a structure. It was a testament to the power of community, where shared living wasn't just a social custom, but a fundamental strategy for survival and warmth. It was a grand, living, breathing heater powered by the very people and animals who called it home. Beyond the collective warmth of bodies and the ingenious design of the longhouse, what you wore, even indoors, was paramount. Let's delve into the vital role of clothing, layers, and materials. You aren't seeing cotton t-shirts or synthetic fleece here. Instead, you're looking at natural fibers, meticulously crafted to trap warmth. This reliance on animal products and carefully layered garments is a mainstream historical fact, essential for surviving the Nordic climate both inside and outside the longhouse. Your first line of defense against the cold, even when huddled by the fire, would be wool. Sheep's wool was the undisputed champion of Viking textiles. It's an incredible material because it retains its insulating properties even when damp, unlike cotton, which becomes useless when wet. Imagine thick, itchy, but incredibly warm tunics, trousers, and cloaks, all woven from coarse wool. These weren't designed for comfort in the modern sense, but for pure, unadulterated thermal efficiency. You'd likely be wearing several layers of wool, starting with thinner undergarments and building up to heavier outer layers. It's the ancient equivalent of your modern thermal underwear and a heavy sweater, all in one scratchy package. Over the wool, you might wear items made from linen, especially during warmer months or as a base layer against the skin to absorb moisture. But for true warmth, wool was king. For outerwear, and often even indoors during the coldest periods, animal furs and hides were indispensable. Think of sheepskins, deerskins, and perhaps even bear or wolf pelts, draped over the shoulders or used as blankets. These furs provided an unparalleled level of insulation, trapping air in their dense fibers. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that the choice of specific furs might have also reflected social status, but functionally, they were all about warmth. Imagine wrapping yourself in a thick, shaggy bear pelt. You'd be less worried about fashion and more about not freezing your nose off. Historians still argue whether Vikings wore distinct indoor and outdoor clothing, or if many garments served double duty, simply adding or shedding layers as needed. It's likely a combination. Some basic tunics would be worn inside, with heavier cloaks and furs added when venturing out or when the longhouse got particularly chilly. The concept of dressing in layers, known to outdoor enthusiasts today, was instinctively understood by the Vikings. Each layer trapped a small pocket of air, and multiple layers meant multiple air pockets, creating a highly effective insulating system. Footwear, even indoors, was important. You wouldn't be barefoot on a cold earthen floor. Soft leather shoes or boots, often lined with wool or fur, would have kept your feet warm. And socks? Definitely wool. Keeping your extremities warm was crucial for overall body temperature regulation. You might also have seen woolen leg wraps, providing an extra layer of warmth to the lower legs. The practicalities of Viking clothing also extended to protecting themselves from the smoke. While not a direct insulator, the dense weaves of wool would have offered some protection from the constant, low-level smoke from the fire pit, preventing it from permeating their skin and undergarments too quickly. You can almost feel the weight and texture of these rough, hand-woven garments, imagining the hours spent spinning wool and weaving fabric. It was a constant, ongoing process, vital for the survival of every individual in the longhouse. So, as you observe the inhabitants moving about the longhouse, you see a living testament to sensible, practical dressing. Their clothing wasn't about style statements. It was about survival, about making the most of every fiber and fur to create a personal, portable cocoon of warmth. It reminds you that even the simplest fabrics, when used cleverly, can be powerful tools against the most formidable natural challenges. With your mental picture of Viking layers complete, let's consider another fundamental, yet often underestimated, source of internal warmth: food and drink. You won't find light salads or chilled beverages here. Instead, the Viking diet was a hearty, energy-rich affair, perfectly designed to fuel bodies in a cold climate and generate heat from within. This emphasis on calorie-dense, warming foods is a mainstream historical fact, crucial for sustained energy and thermal regulation. Imagine the aroma wafting from the central fire pit, the rich, savory scent of meat stewing in a large pot, perhaps slow-cooked over hours. The Viking diet was heavily reliant on meat and fish, providing essential fats and proteins. Think of dried and salted fish, smoked meats, and fresh game when available. These weren't just tasty, they were incredibly energy-dense. Digesting such foods requires the body to work, and that metabolic process itself generates heat. It's like your body's internal furnace being constantly stoked with high-octane fuel. You can almost feel your own stomach rumble, imagining a hearty portion of slow-cooked mutton. Beyond the main courses, grains like barley and oats were staple foods, often made into porridges or bread. These provided complex carbohydrates, offering a steady release of energy over time, preventing the sudden drops in body temperature that can come from insufficient fuel. Root vegetables, when available, would also have been added to stews, contributing vitamins and fiber. This combination of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates created a balanced, albeit heavy, diet perfectly suited for enduring long periods of cold and demanding physical labor. It's a bit like continuously fueling a small, efficient engine that keeps you warm from the inside out. And then there's the liquid side of things. While water was, of course, consumed, the Vikings also brewed ale and mead. While we might associate these with revelry, they also served a practical purpose. These fermented beverages provided calories and, in the short term, a feeling of warmth due to the alcohol's vasodilating effect, bringing blood to the surface. However, this is a quirky or fringe tidbit to consider. While alcohol makes you feel warmer, it actually lowers your core body temperature in the long run. So, it was a short-lived warmth, perhaps, but certainly a comforting one on a cold evening. Just don't overdo it, or you might find yourself stumbling outside and regretting your life choices. Historians still argue whether the consumption of alcohol was primarily for its caloric value, its preservative properties, or its social and cultural significance. It was likely all of these. In a time before refrigeration, fermented drinks were also safer to consume than potentially contaminated water sources, adding another layer of practical benefit. Hot drinks were also a possibility, though perhaps less common than cold beverages. Hot water with herbs or honey could provide a comforting internal warmth. And of course, the communal aspect of eating together around the fire pit further amplified the feeling of warmth. Sharing a meal, passing dishes, and engaging in conversation would have created a strong sense of community and well-being, which contributes to feeling warmer both physically and emotionally. The entire process of food preparation itself also contributed to the Longhouses' warmth. The fire was constantly tended for cooking, releasing heat into the air. The act of stirring stews, grinding grain, and preparing meals kept the inhabitants active, generating their own body heat. It was a cycle of warmth. The environment demanded high-energy food, the preparation of that food generated heat, and the consumption of it fueled the internal furnace of each individual. You can almost taste the smoky, rich flavors and feel the warmth spreading through your body, a testament to the Vikings' understanding of practical, sustaining nutrition in a challenging world. Now that you've imagined the internal warmth of Viking sustenance, let's consider the foresight and sheer hard work that went into winter preparations and provisions. Staying cozy in a longhouse wasn't just about daily habits. It was about months of meticulous planning and relentless labor, a full-scale assault on the coming cold. This extensive seasonal preparation is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the immense effort required to survive. Imagine late summer and autumn in a Viking settlement. The days are growing shorter, the air crisper, and there's an undeniable urgency in every task. This is when the real work of ensuring winter warmth began. First and foremost, vast quantities of firewood had to be gathered and processed. You'd see entire families, men, women, and children, felling trees, splitting logs, and hauling them back to the longhouse. This wasn't just a casual chore. It was a race against time before the first heavy snows made the forests impassable. Piles of wood would be stacked meticulously outside, often under a lean-to to keep them dry, ensuring a ready supply for months. The very act of cutting and hauling wood would have been an incredibly demanding physical activity, generating its own heat for the workers. Beyond fuel, the longhouse itself required attention. You'd observe repairs being made to the turf roof, patching any thin spots or leaks that might have developed during the year. Walls might be redaubed, or strengthened. Any drafts or cracks would be sealed as best as possible, perhaps with mud, moss, or animal dung. It was a constant battle against the elements trying to find their way in. This meticulous sealing and maintenance, ensuring the integrity of their thermal envelope, is a quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights their deep understanding of insulation, even without scientific terms. They knew that a small crack could mean a significant loss of precious warmth. Food provisions were equally critical. Animals would be slaughtered and processed, their meat salted, smoked, or dried to last through the winter. Fish would be caught in abundance, then dried on racks or fermented. Grains harvested from the fields would be stored in cool, dry places, often in large wooden chests within the longhouse or a nearby storage pit. Imagine the sheer volume of food needed to sustain an entire family and their animals for months without fresh supplies. This meticulous food preservation wasn't just about avoiding hunger. It was about maintaining the energy to keep warm. A hungry body is a cold body. Historians still argue whether the level of communal cooperation in these preparations was uniform across all Viking societies, or if individual households bore the primary burden. Regardless, the scale of the task demanded significant effort from everyone. The entire community, or at least the household, would be focused on this single goal, stocking up for survival. Even the animals, as we discussed, were part of the winter preparations. They would be brought into the longhouse or a connected stable section as the temperatures plummeted, turning them from outdoor livestock into vital internal heat sources. Their feed, hay, dried leaves, and stored grains, would also need to be ready and easily accessible. This period of intense preparation created a sense of shared purpose and resilience. You can almost feel the collective breath held, anticipating the long, dark, and challenging months ahead. Every successful harvest, every split log, every sealed crack was a small victory against the looming winter. And when the snow finally did fall, blanketing the landscape in a deep, cold silence, the inhabitants of the longhouse could rest, relatively secure in the knowledge that their tireless efforts had provided them with the best possible chance of staying cozy until spring. Having considered the monumental efforts of winter provisioning, let's pivot to a subtle yet significant aspect of longhouse design that directly impacted warmth: the role of light and small openings. You won't find expansive windows or grand skylights here. Instead, you'll observe that any openings for light were deliberately minimal, a choice driven by the paramount need to conserve heat. This scarcity of large openings is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing a practical trade-off between illumination and insulation. Imagine the longhouse's interior on a typical winter day. It's never brightly lit in the modern sense. The primary source of illumination during daylight hours would be the central smoke hole directly above the fire pit, and perhaps a few small, narrow slits high up on the walls. These slits, often no wider than a hand, were not designed for viewing the outside world, but merely to allow a sliver of natural light to penetrate the deep interior. They were like tiny, rudimentary skylights and side windows, acting more as light tunnels than full panes. You might find yourself squinting slightly, constantly adjusting to the pervasive dimness, a stark contrast to our brightly lit homes. This deliberate lack of large openings was a genius, if uncomfortable, insulation strategy. Every hole in a wall or roof, no matter how well covered, is a potential avenue for heat to escape and cold air to infiltrate. By minimizing these breaches, the Vikings effectively created a more sealed and therefore warmer environment. It's a bit like wearing a thick, unbroken winter coat versus one with lots of mesh panels. Less holes means less heat loss. This focus on minimizing openings for warmth, often at the expense of natural light, is a quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals their pragmatic approach to survival over aesthetics. Historians still argue whether the small size of these openings was solely for thermal reasons, or if factors like structural integrity, large windows weaken walls, and security, smaller openings are harder for intruders to exploit, also played a significant role. It's likely a combination of these practical considerations. However, their impact on the longhouse's thermal performance is undeniable. During the darkest parts of winter, even these small openings would offer little relief. The longhouse would rely heavily on the flickering glow of the central fire pit and, at night, perhaps the use of oil lamps or tallow candles. These would be rudimentary affairs, providing only localized light, emphasizing the overall dimness of the space. Imagine trying to perform intricate tasks by the weak glow of a single oil lamp. It would require patience and good eyesight. The smoke hole, while essential for ventilation, also had to be managed to prevent excessive heat loss. It might have had a simple flap or cover that could be partially closed during extreme cold or high winds. This adjustment would be a constant negotiation, letting enough smoke out without letting too much heat escape. It was a delicate balance, requiring a keen awareness of the weather conditions outside. You can almost feel the slight draft from the smoke hole, a necessary evil for breathing. So, as you observe the muted light filtering into the longhouse, you're witnessing a stark example of necessity dictating design. The Vikings willingly sacrificed abundant natural light for the profound comfort and survival advantage of retained warmth. Their homes were less about panoramic views and more about creating a dark, earthy, but ultimately warm cocoon against the relentless cold, a truly effective fortress against the biting elements. You've now absorbed the Vikings' ingenious methods for gaining and retaining heat. But let's be honest, life in a longhouse wasn't all cozy fires and communal warmth. There were significant challenges related to hygiene and air quality. You're now acutely aware of the pervasive, earthy scent that clings to the air, a complex bouquet of wood smoke, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the distinct aroma of livestock. This often overlooked aspect of longhouse living is a mainstream historical fact, one that required constant, if rudimentary, management. Imagine breathing in air that's constantly infused with smoke from the central fire. While the smoke vents allowed much of it to escape, a considerable amount would inevitably linger, especially closer to the floor. This meant a constant irritation for the eyes and lungs. You might find yourself subtly rubbing your eyes, and your throat might feel a little scratchy. This wasn't just a minor annoyance. Chronic smoke inhalation likely contributed to various respiratory ailments among the inhabitants. It's a bit like living in a permanent, low-level campfire, and your lungs would certainly get a workout. Then there's the issue of odors. With animals sharing the space, even in a separate section, and a lack of modern plumbing, the smells would be robust. Animal waste, cooking smells, unwashed clothing, and general human effluvia would all contribute to the longhouse's unique olfactory signature. There were no air fresheners or scented candles here. This constant battle against unpleasant smells is a quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets glossed over in romanticized portrayals of Viking life. Imagine explaining to a modern friend that your perfume was just a layer of smoky wool and the lingering scent of livestock. Historians still argue whether the Vikings had any formalized systems for waste management beyond simply removing it from the longhouse periodically. It's plausible that specific areas within or just outside the longhouse were designated for waste, which would then be used as fertilizer. But the immediate environment would still have borne the traces. The earthen floors, while practical, also absorbed smells and moisture, contributing to the overall ambience. Ventilation was a constant balancing act. The smoke hole was crucial, but opening it too wide meant sacrificing precious heat. The small slits in the walls offered minimal air exchange. So, the air inside could become quite stale, especially during long winter nights when everyone was huddled inside with the openings largely sealed against the cold. You might even find yourself craving a gust of fresh, clean air from outside, even if it was freezing. Despite these challenges, the Vikings weren't entirely oblivious to hygiene. While baths might have been less frequent than we're accustomed to, they did exist, often involving heated water from the fire pit. Hand washing, especially before meals, would have been practiced, and the regular sweeping and clearing of floors would have helped to manage waste and keep the immediate living areas as clean as possible. The animal sections would have been mucked out periodically, with the valuable manure collected for agricultural use. It's a powerful reminder that cozy in the Viking age didn't mean clean by modern standards. Their comfort was a different kind of comfort, one born of survival and resilience in the face of harsh environmental realities. You're experiencing a multi-sensory immersion into their world, and sometimes that means accepting the less glamorous aspects of historical living. But even with the smoke and smells, the warmth of the longhouse, compared to the biting cold outside, would have been a profoundly welcome embrace. Having endured the olfactory realities of longhouse living, let's consider a continuous, year-round task essential to maintaining its warmth and integrity: repairs and maintenance for longevity. A longhouse wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it structure. It was a living entity, constantly battling against decay and the relentless forces of nature. This ongoing need for upkeep is a mainstream historical fact, demanding constant vigilance and effort from its inhabitants. Imagine the sheer amount of wear and tear on a structure made primarily of organic materials like wood, turf, and wattle and daub. Wood rots, turf erodes, and the daub can crack. The constant fluctuations in temperature and humidity, from the baking summer sun to the freezing winter snows, would have taken their toll. You'd likely see evidence of ongoing patch-ups: a recently replaced roof section, a newly replastered portion of a wall, or a sturdy wooden beam showing signs of repair. It was a cycle of construction, use, and repair that defined the longhouse's existence. The turf roof, while a brilliant insulator, also required the most regular attention. Over time, the turf could settle, creating hollows where water might pool, leading to leaks. Or, extreme weather could simply dislodge sections. So, periodically, the inhabitants would have to climb onto the roof, replace old turf sections, and possibly even reseed it with grass to maintain its integrity and insulating properties. This maintenance of the living roof, literally growing its own insulation, is a quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights their deep practical connection to the land. Imagine having to mow your roof. The wooden structure, the very skeleton of the longhouse, also needed care. Timbers could warp, crack, or eventually succumb to rot, especially where they met the damp earth. This would necessitate replacement or reinforcement. Imagine the painstaking process of cutting a new beam, shaping it with hand tools, and then integrating it into an existing structure. It was a skilled craft, passed down through generations. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of an axe and the scrape of a knife as repairs are made. Historians still argue whether large-scale repairs were a communal effort involving multiple households, or if each longhouse unit was responsible for its own upkeep. It's probable that major undertakings, like replacing a main support beam, might have involved neighbors, while routine patching and minor repairs were the daily burden of the household. Regardless, the work was constant. Beyond the major structural elements, smaller repairs were ongoing. The packed earth floor would need to be retrodden and perhaps resurfaced periodically to maintain a level, firm surface. The fire pit might need its stone lining replaced or reset. Even the interior fittings, like the sleeping benches and storage chests, would have needed mending and cleaning. It was a never-ending cycle of mending, cleaning, and fortifying their sanctuary against the relentless assault of time and weather. This constant maintenance wasn't just about preserving the structure. It was about preserving its ability to provide warmth. A leaky roof or a crumbling wall meant cold air seeping in and precious heat escaping. So, every repair, no matter how small, was an act of preserving comfort and ensuring survival, especially as the long, dark winters approached. You can feel the sturdy resilience of the place, a testament to the persistent effort of its previous inhabitants, securing their warmth for generations. Having seen the meticulous maintenance required to keep a longhouse standing and warm, let's broaden our perspective and consider how these heating strategies varied. The concept of Viking longhouse isn't a single, uniform blueprint. Rather, it's a spectrum of designs and thermal adaptations across a vast geographical area. So, let's explore the adaptations across regions. This regional variation is a mainstream historical fact, driven by local climate, available resources, and cultural nuances. Imagine yourself standing on the windswept Faroe Islands, then transported to the dense forests of Sweden, and finally to the treeless expanse of Greenland. The longhouse you would encounter in each location would share core similarities: the central fire pit, the communal living, but their specific features for staying warm would differ significantly. In the more timber-rich regions like Norway and Sweden, you'd see a greater emphasis on wooden construction. Here, the longhouses would often feature robust timber frames with plank walls, sometimes with double layers for insulation, packed with moss or earth. The timber was abundant, making it the most logical choice. You might imagine the satisfying thud of axe on wood, echoing through the northern forests as families prepared their building materials. This ready access to timber allowed for a focus on sturdy, interlocking wooden structures. Now, shift your mental scenery to Iceland or Greenland. Here, timber was a rare and precious commodity, often driftwood, or imported at great cost. Consequently, the longhouses in these regions show a profound adaptation. They are overwhelmingly built from turf and stone. Massive walls of carefully cut turf blocks, sometimes several feet thick, would rise from stone foundations. These turf walls, with their entangled root systems and dense soil, provided phenomenal insulation against the constant winds and extreme cold. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that some of these turf houses would actually have grass growing on their roofs and walls, literally blending into the landscape, like hobbit holes, but for Vikings. Imagine having to mow your house. The differences weren't just in the walls. The size and number of fire pits could also vary. In extremely cold regions, a longhouse might have multiple hearths or a larger, more continuously burning fire to compensate for the lower external temperatures. Conversely, in slightly milder areas, the fire management might be less intense. You might also notice variations in the layout of the animal sections, with more integrated or robust animal housing in places where the livestock's body heat was even more critical for human survival. Historians still argue whether these regional adaptations were purely pragmatic responses to environmental conditions, or if specific building traditions and cultural preferences also played a role in shaping the longhouse design. It's likely a dynamic interplay, where practical needs met inherited knowledge and available skills. For instance, the techniques for cutting and stacking turf blocks would have been highly developed in Greenland, a skill less critical in forested Norway. Even within a single region, local variations might exist based on the specific microclimate of a settlement. Perhaps a longhouse built in a sheltered valley would have slightly different thermal needs than one exposed on a coastal plain. You can almost feel the biting wind on an open coastal settlement, driving the inhabitants to seek the most robust and insulated shelters possible, while a longhouse nestled amongst trees might have a slightly less urgent need for absolute maximum insulation. These adaptations highlight the remarkable ingenuity of the Vikings, not as a monolithic culture, but as adaptable peoples who mastered their specific environments. Their cozy wasn't a universal standard. It was a localized solution, crafted from the ground up to keep them alive and relatively comfortable in some of the most unforgiving climates on Earth. You've traveled through time, felt the chill of the Nordic winds, and found refuge in the surprising warmth of the Viking longhouse, exploring its many layers of ingenuity. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's reflect on the enduring legacy of Viking warmth. The principles they employed, born of necessity and observation, continue to resonate even in our hypermodern, technologically advanced world. This timeless relevance of basic insulation and resourcefulness is a mainstream historical fact, reminding us that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most profound. Imagine how much we can learn from their profound connection to materials and environment. The thick turf roofs, the use of earth and natural fibers for insulation, the deliberate minimization of openings. These are all echoes of what we now call passive house design or sustainable architecture. The Vikings were, in a sense, pioneers of energy efficiency long before such terms existed. They didn't have blueprints or architectural degrees, but they instinctively understood how to create a thermal envelope that worked with, rather than against, nature. You might even find yourself looking at your own home differently, wondering how much warmth escapes through your windows. The concept of thermal mass, where materials like thick earth or stone absorb heat slowly and release it over time, was naturally incorporated into their longhouses. This fundamental principle, applied across the board, helped to stabilize internal temperatures, preventing rapid drops in warmth even as the fire dwindled. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that, while Vikings certainly weren't thinking about BTUs per square foot, their design decisions effectively maximized them. They were creating thermal batteries, just in a very earthy, organic way. Historians still argue whether the comprehensive thermal efficiency of the longhouse was the result of deliberate, scientific understanding or generations of trial and error leading to optimized designs. It was likely a blend of both. Practical experience would have guided their choices, leading to structures that were incredibly well suited to their challenging climate. They built what worked, and what worked was surprisingly sophisticated in its simplicity. Their approach to communal living also holds a quiet lesson. While modern society often prioritizes individual space and privacy, the Longhouse reminds us of the inherent warmth, both physical and psychological, that comes from shared existence. The collective body heat, the shared chores around the fire, the stories told in the dim, smoky light. These elements created a cohesive, resilient unit, better equipped to face the harsh realities of winter. You can almost feel the presence of dozens of people, each contributing their warmth to the whole, a silent testament to the power of community. The resourcefulness displayed in their winter preparations, the relentless gathering of firewood, the meticulous food preservation, the constant repairs, speaks volumes about human adaptability. It reminds us that survival often hinges on foresight, hard work, and a deep respect for the cycles of nature. There were no shortcuts, no easy fixes, just continuous effort to ensure comfort and continuity through the long, dark months. As you step back from this mental immersion, you can see the Longhouse not just as a historical artifact, but as a testament to enduring human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It offers a gentle reminder that warmth isn't always about complex machinery. Sometimes, it's about thick walls, a well-tended fire, and the comforting presence of those around you. The Vikings stayed cozy not with technology, but with wisdom born of experience, turning the very earth and timber around them into a sanctuary. The flickering embers in the fire pit are fading now, their dance growing softer, casting longer, gentler shadows across the ancient Longhouse. The sounds of 1,000 years ago, the murmur of voices, the crackle of the hearth, the soft breathing of sleeping animals, are slowly receding, like a tide pulling back from the shore. You can feel the quiet peace settling around you, a sense of deep, timeless calm. The cold outside has lost its bite, no longer a threat, merely a whisper on the wind. Your mind, too, begins to drift, the intricate details of Viking life softening at the edges, merging into a comfortable blur. All those clever ways they found to stay warm, all that relentless effort, has led you here, to this moment of quiet repose. The Longhouse, a fortress against the cold, has served its purpose, wrapping you in its ancient, earthy warmth. Let the last lingering traces of wood smoke and the gentle hum of the past lull you into a peaceful slumber. The journey is complete, and a comfortable stillness now embraces you. End of script. Sweet dreams.